I want to touch just very briefly on some key questions, I think, for student engagement and decision making in terms of quality assurance, just because of the audience of today. I think two key questions that we often ask ourselves are how we capture the student voice throughout quality assurance, and indeed how that links to student representation, to governance and management processes, and to teaching and learning itself. And also then how we involve students as partners throughout that quality assurance process. But one key question that I think we need to ask ourselves coming out of the pandemic is how we actually capture and understand what meaningful or authentic student engagement looks like. How do we know that it's meaningful and authentic, and that it is really developing that idea of students as partners, which is very much linked to the engagement side of the house. Next slide, please, Mairead. One thing that comes from that is a question around, if we're talking about student engagement and decision making, who are decision makers in higher education, or indeed in FET, or in any corner of the tertiary education sector? Who are decision makers? We have to ask ourselves that question if we want students to really be involved and participative in decision making processes. And as we move from a reactive to more proactive management of the crisis, I think we learned quite a lot about that. What worked well was, reactive and proactive governance structures that had students embedded throughout. We have students perhaps at the high levels of institutional governance, but where decisions were taken often was at the local level, and how involved students were in those decisions was, I think, key to success in that regard. Linked with that was, students were often being asked to transmit and communicate out key messages to their peers, but that worked most effectively when students were involved in the designing of what those communications were and in the messages that were within them, and that they had a role to play in what was being communicated. And a big part of that was when institutions had institution-wide feedback mechanisms that were quite visible to all students. That, and it's been referred to in Anya's presentation, particularly around this idea of the learning community. And when we're all in something together like a pandemic, I think we learned a lot about what community actually really means. And students are at a disadvantage because of the knowledge. There's a knowledge asymmetry there in higher education, and that staff are more easily able to navigate decision making. So I think what worked well particularly was whenever program level decision making continued, and it didn't get caught up too much in the reactive nature, but to continue to firefight with students together to create, I suppose, high level vision, aims and objectives, and creating that universal culture that Celine talked about in her presentation. So next slide, please, Mairead. Some key lessons that we've learned from our work with student representatives. They were on the front line in terms of peer representation during the pandemic. There's a general sense of frustration that they could have achieved more, and I think we all share that sense of frustration. But I think for students particularly who felt that perhaps all they could do was gather the views of their peers and then communicate that to staff, that it was often more difficult then to create the collaboration and the co-creation that needs to come from that. And that's an understandable thing, but something that I think we need to be keenly aware of as we move forward. What we did learn, though, was that the fundamentals of education were completely shaken. So assessment changed, the way in which lectures and seminars and tutorials and labs, the way all of those things happened, recording, the use of the VLE and understanding how the VLE works, the link to the well-being of all students and staff. Students have been involved in dealing and working through those major issues. That gives them a much greater sense of say and understanding how higher education works and how they can change it. And I think from that we can create more visible representation structures and more visible and empowered representation structures going forward. Two key things that I leave you with are to support staff in order to be able to continue that momentum where it's been found, and to pick up where that momentum perhaps got dropped. And to go back and actually revise and look again at our governance structures or committee structures, and how the ways in which we partner or consult, depending on the way that happens, with reps to more widely promote their role to all students, but to increase the role that they play going forward. And I think that's the last slide. I will just leave you with this. I think in terms of the class rep life cycle, the building relationships and carrying out the role piece is our big focus post-pandemic now, that the role itself carries much more weight within the institutional decision-making process, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.